been damaged by Israeli airstrikes. As noted by one UN official working in Palestine, in Gaza, the largest open-air prison in the world, it has today become the graveyard of a population trapped between war, siege, and deprivation. Mr. President, Pakistan strongly and unequivocally condemns Israeli airstrikes and the systematic and barbaric crimes against the Palestinians, particularly the attacks on schools and residential buildings and even hospitals, such as the Ali Baptist Hospital, where hundreds of sick and injured civilians, men, women, and children, were killed. These Israeli attacks on civilians, civilian objects, and infrastructure, blockade of water, food, and fuel, as well as the forced transfer of people from the occupied territory, are flagrant violations of international humanitarian law and amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Indeed, Mr. President, what we are witnessing on our television screens, what the people of Palestine in Gaza are suffering, may amount to a veritable genocide. As our Secretary General has warned, and as we can all perceive, the situation, I quote, is growing more dire by the hour, unquote. The war, quote, risks spiraling throughout the region, unquote. In this moment, the Secretary General has said, it is vital to be clear on principles, starting with the fundamental principle of respecting and protecting civilians, unquote. Mr. President, we are repelled by the crude and disrespectful Israeli response to the Secretary General's circumspect and valid views. The General Assembly should collectively reject these insulting remarks and reaffirm our full confidence in the Secretary General. Mr. President, as human beings, we must be appalled at the magnitude of the suffering of the helpless Palestinian civilians, especially the children and women. I am sure all of us are also appalled at the vicious and callous way that the Palestinians are being slaughtered by cowardly aerial bombardment and long-range artillery. They are being crucified, not by a militant organization, but by a government which claims to be democratic. And we must also be appalled by those who, by blocking the call for a ceasefire in the Security Council, have enabled the continuation of the Israeli slaughter of innocents. It is the hope of the Arab and OIC countries that the General Assembly, acting under the Uniting for Peace process, will succeed where the Security Council has failed. The co-sponsors of the draft resolution in document EA/ES 10/L25 seek three objectives. One, an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. The Israeli killing machine must be stopped in Gaza and the West Bank. Two, the flow of sufficient and sustained humanitarian assistance into Gaza to preserve lives and prevent further suffering of innocent Palestinians. And three, to ensure that the Palestinian population of Gaza is not further displaced within or outside Gaza. Mr. President, it is shocking that even these largely humanitarian objectives, set out in the most circumspect language, have been opposed by some in the General Assembly. Even the call for a ceasefire has faced objections. This position is unjustifiable, legally and morally. Furthermore, an amendment has been moved to insert condemnatory language that is one-sided, discriminatory, and legally contentious. If equity is to be served, we would need to insert language to reflect the realities of this war in a balanced and clear manner. One, to reaffirm the right of the Palestinian people under international law to struggle by all possible means, including armed struggle, to secure their freedom from foreign occupation and exercise their right to self-determination. And two, to strongly and unequivocally condemn Israel's barbarous and indiscriminate bombing of Palestinian civilians and protected objects and sites in flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. Without such balancing language, we will vote resolutely against the one-sided Canadian amendment. Mr. President, in the context of this war, consideration should also be given to some form of an accountability mechanism. The crimes that are being committed cannot go unpunished. We have several recent precedents of accountability mechanisms from which to choose. And finally, for the future, we need to consider ways to prevent a recurrence of this slaughter. The OIC foreign ministers have proposed the deployment of a protection force to safeguard Palestinian civilians in the Gaza and perhaps also in the West Bank. We should give serious consideration to this. Mr. President, it is only once this war is brought to an end, once the killing stops, that we can turn to find a durable solution. The resolution which we have presented seeks to do just that, to stop the killing, to stop the war, and turn back to find a durable political solution. I urge all member states to vote for our resolution. I urge them all to vote against the one-sided Canadian amendment. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Pakistan for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Thailand.
Mr. President, Thailand welcomes the convening of this 10th Emergency Special Session of the United Nations General Assembly today because of the urgency of the situation and plight of all affected civilians. Thailand is deeply concerned over the escalation of hostilities and violence in the Middle East caused by the unprecedented developments in Israel and Gaza. The heightened hostilities and the scale and scope of violence have claimed thousands of innocent lives, with many more injured and displaced. These include children, women, the elderly, and the sick. The massive and escalating use of force have destroyed their livelihoods and communities. Thailand is profoundly shocked and deeply saddened by the attack on Al-Ahli Arab Hospital in the north of Gaza, resulting in loss of life of innocent civilians and casualties. To alleviate the suffering by civilians, we oppose the withholding of access to basic necessities such as water, food, electricity, and fuel as weapons of war. Now, such access should be restored. We also oppose the targeting of critical civilian infrastructure. This should cease. Thailand offers our deepest condolences to everyone who lost their lives and their bereaved families. Our deepest sympathies are extended to all those who are suffering. No family should have to face such tragedy. No family should have to feel such anguish. No family should have to mourn such loss of loved ones. We are also victims. Thai nationals have been killed and injured. We are deeply concerned for the safety of Thai nationals as well as those captured and held hostage. We strongly appeal for their immediate release and safe return. Now, this has been echoed by the ASEAN foreign ministers in their statement of 20th October. We thus welcome the references in the draft resolution calling for their immediate and unconditional release. Thailand condemns in the strongest terms all forms of violence and attacks on civilians in conflict situations, including capturing and taking them hostage. Thailand urges all sides to respect and fulfill their obligations under international humanitarian law and to ensure the safety and dignity of civilians in conflict situations. The protection of innocent lives and civilians must be a priority at all times. Now, this should be our calling at this critical juncture. This should be our unifying catalyst as we seek to alleviate the suffering. As the situation escalates, the most urgent concern is for all civilians who have been affected. Unimpeded access to humanitarian assistance must be ensured. We welcome efforts by various parties to ensure such access to humanitarian assistance, and in this connection, we welcome the initial humanitarian relief that has recently entered into Gaza and hope that this will be increased in the days ahead. Many lives are at stake. Many more are at risk. We appeal to the international community to continue to mobilize humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza to ensure that they have access to basic necessities, including safe and clean water, food, and medical care. Thailand joins others in the call for all sides to take immediate steps to prevent the escalation of violence and implement an immediate ceasefire. We appeal all sides to seek all avenues to resolve the current situation and work towards a long-term peace through diplomacy. Thailand will continue to support the United Nations and the international community in any way we can to de-escalate the situation. We reaffirm our support for genuine dialogue with a view to finding a mutually agreed peaceful solution to the issue in accordance with the two-state solution, by which the states of Israel and Palestine live side by side in peace and security within secure and recognized borders consistent with relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions. Let us do our utmost to save lives and to bring those captured and held hostage home. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Thailand for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Mr. President, Vietnam is participating in this emergency special session with a heavy heart and with great concern on the escalated situation in the Middle East. It is regrettable that the Security Council has been unable to take action on this urgent matter. We urge the Council to continue to work together to address the situation immediately. We also hope that the Council and the UN at large can send a unified and constructive message aimed at de-escalating tensions, ending hostilities, protecting civilians, and promoting dialogue and negotiations. Mr. President, my home country is not unfamiliar with disproportionate casualties and the destruction of critical infrastructure in situations of conflict. This takes an incredibly heavy toll, not only on human life, but also on socio-economic foundations that impede development for decades. Vietnam, therefore, once and again condemns in the strongest terms all indiscriminate attacks targeted at civilians and critical civilian infrastructure. They must be protected under international law, especially in compliance with international humanitarian law and relevant UN Security Council resolutions. I'd like to express our deep sympathy and condolences to the families of all civilians who lost their lives, including UN workers, in the recent flare-ups of conflict starting on October 7th and continuous events thereafter. If history can tell us anything, it is innocent civilians who bear the brunt of armed conflicts. All human life is precious, irrespective of race, religions, or gender. This is why all acts of hostilities and violence must end immediately in order to stop further suffering and bloodshed. Hostages must be safely released at once and without conditions. We strongly urge all parties to refrain from the use of force and exercise utmost restraint. Violence only incites more violence. There is a lot of work to be done. We call for urgent provisions, especially by the UN, of rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian assistance. Water, food, medical supplies, fuel, and electricity must reach those in serious need. We urge all concerned parties to make every effort to facilitate this. Vietnam welcomes and commends all international mediation and reconciliation efforts towards a peaceful, just, and lasting resolution to this conflict, which must be based on international law and relevant resolutions of the United Nations. Durable peace can only be achieved through a comprehensive solution. It is our consistent position to support the two-step solution for the establishment of an independent state of Palestine that coexists in peace with the state of Israel based on the pre-1967 borders and with East Jerusalem as its capital. Vietnam calls upon all concerned parties to work towards an environment that is conducive to the cessation of hostilities, the escalation of tensions, and the return to peace talks and negotiations. All of us must actively contribute to that end. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Vietnam for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Austria.
Mr. President, Excellencies, Austria aligns itself with the statement of the European Union held earlier. At the outset, let me once again emphasize that Austria condemns the heinous terrorist attack by Hamas on Israeli civilians on 7 October in the strongest possible terms. The attack was unprecedented in its brutality. There is no justification for terror. Israel has the inherent right to defend itself in the face of such violent and indiscriminate attacks in line with international humanitarian law. We call for an immediate and unconditional release of all hostages abducted by Hamas and other terrorist organizations. Our joint priority must now be to prevent a regional escalation of violence and hostilities, and we welcome efforts of all partners in this regard. We call on all regional actors to refrain from any action that adds further fuel to the fire. Colleagues, let's be clear. It was the barbaric terror attack by Hamas that brought unbearable suffering on innocent people. It is Hamas that puts the civilian population in Gaza in harm's way, including by using them as human shields. By purposefully directing its resources and urgently needed fuel to its rocket launchers instead of to desalination plants and hospitals, Hamas also bears responsibility for the humanitarian hardships of the civilians in Gaza. Colleagues, international humanitarian law must be respected at all times. It is crucial to ensure the protection of civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and schools, and to allow access to water in Gaza, rapidly deteriorating situation in Gaza, and reiterate the importance of urgently and ensure that it is used by terrorist organizations. We support the unimpeded access throughout Gaza, sustained effort to deliver vital life-saving assistance to the population. We welcome the recent humanitarian deliveries via the Rafah crossing point and thank all actors involved, including Egypt, the United States, the United Nations, and Israel in facilitating these deliveries. Mr. President, both Israelis and Palestinians have the right to live in peace and security. We should not allow anyone to undermine the positive dynamic that normalization of relations between several Arab countries and Israel. But it has come more than clear who is not interested in any sort of peace: Hamas and other terror organizations. They have no future to offer to the Palestinian people. Genuine peace and security for Israelis and Palestinians alike can only be achieved through a political solution. For us, the goal is clear. We need a negotiated two-state solution allowing Israelis and Palestinians to live side by side in peace and security. Our guiding principle is and will remain international law. Mr. President, let me briefly turn to another aspect of this debate. One reason for gathering in the GA today is that several vetoes prevented the Security Council from adopting a resolution. As we have said at other occasions, the veto right of the permanent members should not paralyze the Security Council from discharging its duties. We therefore welcome that we've had the opportunity to have this discussion here today. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Austria for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this emergency special session. For 3 weeks now, unspeakable scenes of human suffering continue to unfold in Gaza. Millions of civilians are under indiscriminate bombing. They are deprived of water, food, electricity, and fuel, collectively punished under a complete siege. There can be no justification for the indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure. These acts of collective punishment and attempts at forced displacement of people are unacceptable and have to be stopped. We must be unequivocal in condemning and opposing loss of each and every innocent life. There is an urgent need for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. Uninterrupted humanitarian access to and within Gaza is also an absolute necessity. In this connection, we commend the efforts of the Secretary General and relevant UN agencies on the ground. Mr. President, under these dire circumstances, international community has to come up with a unified position to make these imperatives happen. It is the responsibility of the United Nations to help achieve this unity and deliver results in terms of maintaining international peace and security. However, this has not been possible until now due to the paralysis of the Security Council. Therefore, it is incumbent upon the General Assembly to rise to the occasion and do its utmost to make UN system function. It is in this understanding that as Turkey we co-sponsored the draft resolution entitled Protection of Civilians and Upholding Legal and Humanitarian Obligations, and call all member states to support this resolution. It includes the bare minimum requirements to stop the carnage and help de-escalate the situation on the ground. Mr. President, we must prevent this conflict from spilling out of control and spilling over other areas. Sustained security cannot be achieved by targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. No peace is possible or sustainable as long as the Palestinian aspirations for freedom, dignity, and statehood continue to be oppressed. A just and comprehensive settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can only be realized through a peace process based on two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Turkey for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Tunisia.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. Tunisia welcomes the convening of this 10th emergency special session on the question of Palestine, and we support this statement delivered by the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan on behalf of the Arab group, as well as a statement delivered by the distinguished representative of Mauritania on behalf of the Organization for Islamic Cooperation. And we wish to deliver the following remarks in our national capacity. After the failure by the Security Council on a number of occasions to adopt a resolution to end the aggression and genocide perpetrated by the occupying forces against the Palestinian people over the past 3 weeks, what has resulted in 7,000 martyrs up until this point, we hope that the international community will be able to take this emergency session and to meet its historic and moral responsibility and to uphold justice, law, and the values upon which this organization was established, as well as human rights, peace, and security. While we condemn categorically the war crimes perpetrated by the occupying power against Palestinian civilians and the systematic targeting of women, children, families with targeted attacks, targeting hospitals and emergency personnel, holy sites being targeted, as well as with policies which are geared towards halting essential services. These are being used as means of war. We cannot allow the international community to remain silent and for the failure of international institutions and bodies. First and foremost, the Security Council, their failure to uphold their responsibility. What does the international community expect in terms of action? How many? What is the international community is waiting for to act? How many Palestinian civilians need to die for the international community to honor its moral and humanitarian responsibility, as well as its legal responsibility, which requires for an immediate ceasefire? As we have stated on a number of occasions, we reject the double standards, the selectivity when it comes to international law, and we call for an end to manipulation for the distorted realities and attempts to justify crimes. We urge the Secretary General to continue efforts to achieve a ceasefire and to deliver humanitarian assistance to Gaza. And we reject the attacks against the Secretary General. Mr. President, we find ourselves at a critical juncture. We are bearing witness to a genocide and the forced eviction of the residents of Gaza from their territory, as well as practices of blockade and unprecedented violations of their right. This is carried out in the eyes of the world, and this is carried out in a manner that is in contempt for all international bodies. Even in the international community, the United Nations and institutions fail to intervene today, they will not rise to the magnitude of this crisis. If they fail to stop these heinous crimes against humanity, and if they fail to deliver uninterrupted, unselective humanitarian assistance, if they fail to stop the evictions of Palestinian people, then there will be no achievement of justice. The international community will then have agreed to find itself hostage to egregious violations of international humanitarian law, human rights, and all the principles and values upon which the United Nations was founded. Mr. President, Tunisia takes great care to uphold the principles of justice and law. We reject any forms of injustice and aggression. We reiterate our support for the fraternal Palestinian people, and we call for an end to war crimes being perpetrated by the occupying forces. And we call for respect for rights. We reject the equivalence between the occupying aggressor and the aggressed, and we reject the attempts to advance erroneous ideas about the rights to self-defense to justify genocide. Justice is clear, and the rights of the Palestinian people need to be inviolable and upheld. We hope that the General Assembly will adopt a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire to end further bloodletting, to deliver protection to the Palestinian people, and to prevent attempts to evict people by force while delivering humanitarian and medical assistance in an ongoing way to the Gaza Strip. In this regard, we call on member states to support the draft resolution tabled by the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan to end this humanitarian tragedy. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Tunisia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Brazil welcomes the reconvening of the 10th emergency session of the General Assembly after the failure by the Security Council to adopt any of 4 draft resolutions on the situation in Israel and Palestine. One of them was proposed by Brazil and not adopted due to the veto of 1 permanent member, despite having received 12 votes in favor, 4/5 of the Council membership. We worked tirelessly in an inclusive and constructive manner with diligence and sense of duty with all delegations willing to engage with our proposal. Our goal was that of presenting a text that carried a resolute and united response by the Security Council. We did not shy away from the negotiations and deliberations on the proposals that were put forward by other members of the Security Council. We still believe that our first draft could have been the best possible outcome of the Council when we presented it. The robust support given by Council members to the resolution, for which we are very grateful, indicates that it was a balanced text. It was solidly rooted in international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and fundamentally committed to the humanitarian imperative. Such imperative demands that we be clear and firm in our condemnation of all violence against all civilians, Israelis, Palestinians, or otherwise. This is why my delegation expressed and now reiterates Brazil's unequivocal condemnation of the heinous terrorist acts by Hamas, including the taking of hostages. This is also why we clearly condemn the attacks that are indiscriminately killing and wounding civilians and destroying civilian objects in the Gaza Strip, and the deprivation of its civilian population of means indispensable for their survival. It is again the humanitarian imperative and international humanitarian law that indicate what must be done. All hostages must be immediately and unconditionally released. Continuous, sufficient, and unhindered provision of essential goods and services to civilians throughout the Gaza Strip, including but not limited to water, food, medical supplies, fuel, and electricity, must be secured. It is also urgent to guarantee full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access. Mechanisms such as humanitarian pauses and corridors must be swiftly established to facilitate the provision of humanitarian aid. A cessation of hostilities is urgently needed so that conditions be created for a complete, durable, and respected ceasefire. Our collective response to this crisis, which we all fear will only aggravate if nothing is done, will be a watershed moment for the United Nations. It will be a testament to the effectiveness of multilateralism or its further weakening. It will show whether the United Nations can be serious about preventing, stopping, or at least mitigating the horrors of war. This Assembly and the Security Council must act decisively. The world is watching us, and this is not rhetoric. The world is truly watching us and expects an effective response. Brazil will continue to work tirelessly as President and then as a regular member of the Security Council to make its voice heard loud and clear on this heartbreaking conflict. And when the immediate crisis is overcome, we all must redouble efforts to address the root causes of the tragedy unfolding before our eyes. Mere conflict management has failed. It is the recipe for continued violence and permanent instability. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Brazil for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iraq.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
On behalf of God, the merciful, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I want to thank you for having agreed to the request to hold the 10th emergency session of the General Assembly concerning the issue of Palestine. We support the statement made by the representative of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan on behalf of the Arab group and Mauritania on behalf of the Organization of the Islamic Conference of Islamic Cooperation. Mr. President, the catastrophic situation of the Palestinian people due to the military actions and the barbaric crimes committed by the occupation forces, and in view of the blockade and the a lack of provision of basic necessities and blockade forces us, members of the United Nations, in conformity with the purposes and principles of the Charter, to fulfill our collective responsibility to put an end to the crimes, massacres, and continued destruction of residential neighborhoods with their residents and infrastructure and services. After all these crimes, how can you explain the silence? How can you interpret the failure to take any binding measures to stop these crimes? What can we say about the continuation of massacres and genocide by the occupation forces without any kind of deterrence? Is that an encouragement for the Israeli occupation forces to continue these crimes under the false pretext? Mr. President, we are witnessing a historic turning point within the United Nations, which was created to build and achieve international peace and security. Indeed, the Security Council for the past 3 weeks has failed to fulfill its legal responsibility and to adopt necessary measures to maintain international peace and security and to protect civilians and to stop the bloodletting, that is by stopping military activity, or to open border crossing points to ensure the delivery of humanitarian assistance. We note with regret that the organization is incapable of upholding its principles. For decades, this organization has not been able to resolve the Palestinian issue. Mr. President, this extraordinary session is taking place due to the continuation of Israeli attacks for the past 3 weeks against the Palestinian people, brethren people, in particular in the Gaza Strip. This is a systematic genocide and the imposition of a blockade and forced expulsion. These are crimes that continue a litany of crimes for the past 70 years in front of the very eyes of the international community and the Security Council. This is a flagrant violation of international law and international humanitarian law, of the Charter and of international treaties. Today, as the diplomatic process underway in the Security Council has confirmed that this council is not in a position to fulfill its moral, legal, and humanitarian responsibilities with regard to maintaining international peace and security, and put an end to these barbaric actions and violations against the Palestinian Palestinian people. We find ourselves in the midst of a diplomatic process of the international community that we represent here at this emergency session. We're far from this being selective as far as humanitarian issues and issues of destiny. We must force the occupation forces we must impose a ceasefire and crossing points and ensure delivery of assistance and completely lift the blockade, stop expulsions, and ensure exchange of prisoners, and ensure reconstruction following the destruction that has been caused by forces. This is the tribune to which oppressed people turn to, and we have a collective responsibility to free them from this injustice and grant them the right to life. Many of the images that we're seeing are horrific. Innocent people, women, and children. These images will remain etched in our memories, as will the position of the Security Council in the history of this organization. Lastly, we would like to reiterate our support for the Palestinian people to fulfill their aspirations and legitimate rights that are inviolable, including their right to self-determination, right to return, and the creation of their state, Palestine, with Jerusalem as capital. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Iraq for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom, His Excellency Lord Tariq Ahmed, the Minister for the Middle East, North Africa, and the United Nations. The floor is yours, Lord Tariq.
Thank you, Mr. President. May I begin by expressing our deep appreciation for this institution, the United Nations, and indeed all of our humanitarian partners for their incredible efforts, life-saving efforts, in what are the most challenging of circumstances. And at this point, I also want to share our sincerest of condolences for the 30 UNRWA staff and the 16 medical staff who have lost their lives since the 7th of October. Equally, we record our sincere condolences to the victims and the families of the horrendous Hamas terrorist attacks on the 7th of October on Israel. And equally, we extend our condolences to the families of the innocent Palestinians who have been killed in this tragic conflict. Inna lillahi wa inna ilaihi raji'un. To God we belong, to God we return. Your Excellencies, Mr. President, every life that is lost is a tragedy, not just for a family in Israel or Gaza or the West Bank, but it is a loss for all of humanity. An Israeli life or a Palestinian life, irrespective of being Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. Every life matters. Every life lost is a tragedy. Therefore, as we recall the tragic consequences of what we are witnessing, we call on all parties to respect international humanitarian law. Yes, this means the unconditional release of the hostages and taking every possible step to avoid the harming of civilians, and importantly, enabling unhindered humanitarian access. We all know, it has been said from this podium countless times during this debate, that the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is growing. On our part, the United Kingdom has provided an additional $37 million to help provide water, to help provide food and medicine and fuel in Gaza. And in this regard, may we put on record our thanks to the tireless work of the Secretary General and the United Nations to ensure this life-saving aid reaches those most in need. Whilst we welcome the important first step of 54 trucks passing through Rafah border crossing, we urge the scaling up of this assistance, including to enable fuel for civilian use to pass into Gaza, vital to keep hospitals and the humanitarian response running. And these humanitarian pauses are an important part of ensuring that this can happen. Turning to the attacks on Israel on the 7th of October, my Prime Minister has been clear. The United Kingdom stands with Israel in the face of Hamas terrorist attacks. We will always support an ally against a terrorist attack and its right to self-defense. But this must be, I assure you, Mr. President, and we make that case, it must be within international humanitarian law. And if I may just put also from a personal perspective, as a Muslim, terrorism is evil. Every terror act is against humanity, and we should condemn it unequivocally. So, Mr. President, the draft resolution in front of us could have been clearer on this very point. It should also, in our view, unequivocally condemn these terror attacks, Hamas's terror attacks, that killed over 1,400 people, and, as we know, at this very time, hold over 200 hostages. However, we have equally been clear that all possible precautions and steps are taken to minimize harm to civilians in this conflict, and indeed for any movement of civilians to be both voluntary and safe. Mr. President, We stand at a crucial juncture. Yet, in this moment of darkness, let us come together, this United Nations, that we come together and not lose sight of the promise that this United Nations holds true of a two-state solution, a secure, safe Israel, side by side with a viable Palestinian state. And I assure you of this, that we, the United Kingdom, will continue to work closely with all partners in the region and beyond in these efforts, because peace must prevail, and to prevent the situation from spreading and causing wider insecurity and instability. It was my Prime Minister who said, hope and humanity must win against the scourge of aggression and terrorism. Love over hate, light over darkness, peace, shalom, salam. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom, Lord Ahmed, for his statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru.